I haven't spoken to a woman in 20 years, the mountain man admitted, then kissed her. He'd buried his words with his wife, built a life in silence, and vanished into the pines. But one winter night, a knock broke through the wind, and everything he locked away began to stir. She arrived half frozen, carrying nothing, and yet far too much. He gave her shelter. Then he gave her something he thought was gone. Now the fire's lit again, but not just in the hearth. In the wilderness, where silence keeps men alive and memories stay buried deep, one choice can shake everything loose. What made a man speak again? And what will happen when the past comes knocking next? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The wind howled like a wounded beast through the Montana peaks, rattling the log walls of Boone Dalton's remote cabin. Inside, the old mountain man methodically fed splits of pine into his pot-bellied stove. The familiar motions required no thought, leaving his mind free to drift like the snow outside. 20 years of silence hung heavy in the cabin. 20 years since he'd heard his own voice. 20 years since Sarah had kissed him goodbye and headed down the mountain for supplies, never to return. The memory of finding her, frozen beneath a drift not 3 miles from home, still cut like a knife. Boone's weathered hands moved automatically, adjusting the damper on the stove. The tin cup of coffee at his elbow had gone cold, untouched. Outside, the February storm raged on, bringing an early dusk to the valley. He'd seen worse weather in his 60-some years in these mountains, but not much worse. The knock was so faint he almost missed it. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the wind. But there it came again, a weak tapping against the solid oak door. Boone stood slowly, his joints creaking like old leather. No one ventured this high in weather like this. No one sane, anyway. He lifted the door's heavy wooden bar, fingers tightening around the rifle that was never far from reach. The wind nearly tore the door from his grip as he pulled it open. There, swaying like a ghost in the swirling snow, stood a woman. Her dark eyes met his for just a moment before they rolled back in her head. She collapsed forward, and Boone caught her automatically. Her body was terrifyingly cold, her buckskin dress crusted with ice. Even in the dim light, he could see the telltale blackness of frostbite on her fingers, Lakota, by her dress and features. What was she doing up here alone? Boone dragged her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. He laid her by the stove, his hands shaking as he unwrapped his only spare quilt, Sarah's quilt, and tucked it around her still form. Her breathing was shallow, barely there at all. Working quickly, he set his largest pot of water on the stove to heat. The woman's pulse flickered weakly under his fingers like a guttering candle. She needed warmth, and fast. But something made him hesitate. Life had taught him the wisdom of detachment. 20 years alone in these mountains had reinforced that lesson daily. Getting involved only led to pain. It would be easier to let nature take its course, simpler, safer. But as he looked down at her face, something caught in his chest. Maybe it was the way her dark hair spilled across the floor, or how the firelight caught the curve of her cheek. For just a moment, he was back in that snowdrift 20 years ago, cradling Sarah's lifeless body, wishing he'd been there in time. His throat worked. The words felt strange, foreign, after so many years of silence. They came out as barely more than a whisper, rough as pine bark. "You'll not die here." The sound of his own voice startled him. It seemed to break some sort of spell in the cabin, spurring him to action. He worked through the night, warming blankets by the fire and replacing them as they cooled. He melted snow and heated it just shy of too hot, using it to slowly warm her core temperature. When she started shivering violently, he knew she had a chance. Hour by hour, he tended her like a failing fire, adding heat bit by bit, watching for signs of life. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was breaking. The ice around Boone's heart beginning to crack after 20 years of frozen silence. As dawn approached, her breathing grew stronger, more regular. Color returned to her cheeks, though her frostbitten fingers would need careful tending. She hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she would live. Boone sat back in his chair, exhausted but unable to sleep, watching her chest rise and fall in the gray light of morning. Those 3 words he'd spoken hung in the air like smoke, changing everything. He'd broken his silence to save her life, and now he couldn't take it back. Didn't want to take it back. Something had shifted in that moment, like spring ice breaking up on the river, dangerous and uncertain, but unstoppable once begun. Morning crept into the cabin like a cautious deer, pale light filtering through the frost-covered windows. The woman stirred beneath Sarah's old quilt, her face peaceful now that the worst danger had passed. Boone moved quietly around the cabin, his boots making soft sounds against the wooden floor as he prepared for the day ahead. He set water to boil in the battered coffee pot, then pulled dried elk meat and wrinkled root vegetables from his winter stores. The familiar motions of cooking brought a strange comfort. It had been so long since he'd prepared a meal for anyone but himself. The weak winter sun climbed higher, warming the cabin's interior. By midday, the woman's eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confusion clear on her face, as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her gaze finally settled on Boone, who sat in his chair by the stove, whittling a piece of pine. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Where am I?" Boone poured a cup of weak coffee and brought it to her, helping her sit up against the wall. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone handling a spooked horse. She took a careful sip, then spoke again. "I am called Wichapi." Boone nodded, acknowledging her name without offering his own. He gestured to her swollen ankle and frost-damaged fingers. "They need tending," he said, his voice still rough from disuse. Wichapi watched as he gathered supplies: clean cloths, a pot of warm water, and a tin of salve that smelled strongly of pine pitch and herbs. As he worked on her injuries, she spoke quietly. "I ran from the agency outpost. There was a fire." Her words came slowly, measured. "They said I started it, but I did not. The agent ... She stopped, pain flickering across her face that had nothing to do with her wounds. Boone's hands remained steady as he wrapped her fingers in clean strips of cloth. He didn't press her for more information, but his silence felt different now, listening rather than empty. When he finished with her injuries, he gathered her scattered belongings from where they'd fallen the night before. Her leather satchel was worn but well made, decorated with careful beadwork. As he arranged it beside her bedroll, something caught his eye: a folded paper carefully sewn into the seam. He set the satchel down without removing the document, but filed away its presence in his mind. The day passed slowly. Boone served the stew he'd prepared, rich with dried elk meat and roots. Wichapi ate carefully, managing the spoon despite her bandaged fingers. As evening approached, she looked up from her bowl. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving my life." Boone stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. The words came slowly, pulled from some deep place inside him. "I haven't spoken to a woman in 20 years." Wichapi absorbed this information without surprise or judgment. After a moment, she answered, her voice gentle as falling snow. "Then let's speak like old friends." The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an unusual stillness in its wake. They finished their meal in silence, but something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. The quiet between them felt different now. Not the dead silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet of shared understanding. Boone added another log to the stove, watching as sparks rose up the chimney. 20 years of solitude had taught him the weight of words, how they could change things that seemed unchangeable. He'd spoken more today than he had in 2 decades, and though the words felt strange in his mouth, they no longer burned like they used to. Across the cabin, Wichapi adjusted her position against the wall, wincing slightly as she moved her injured ankle. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding Boone that she was no young woman, but one who had seen her share of winters. Perhaps that's why her presence felt less intrusive than he'd expected. She carried her own silence with dignity, understanding the value of unspoken things. A fragile peace settled over the cabin, delicate as the frost patterns on the windows, but just as real. Neither of them knew what the next day might bring, but for now, the simple act of sharing space and silence was enough. That night, sleep came fitfully to Boone. In his dreams, Sarah's face appeared, not frozen and blue as he'd last seen her, but warm and alive as summer wheat. She stood in their cabin doorway, sunlight streaming behind her, wearing the blue calico dress she'd loved so much. "My dear heart," she said, her voice clear as a mountain stream, "don't let the world make you mean." Boone woke with a start, his chest tight. The cabin was dark, except for the dying embers in the stove. Across the room, Wichapi slept peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. The dream clung to him like morning mist, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. Dawn broke pale and cold. Boone pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The storm had buried everything in white drifts deeper than a man's waist. He followed the trail where Wichapi had stumbled in, looking for any sign of her horse. Near a stand of pine trees, he found a suspicious mound. Digging revealed leather reins and a frozen stirrup. The horse was completely buried, long past saving. They were trapped until the weather broke. No way around it. Boone spent an hour chopping wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe helping to settle his troubled thoughts. When he returned inside, Wichapi was awake, attempting to rebandage her injured fingers. While she dozed again later that morning, Boone's eyes kept returning to her satchel. The hidden document nagged at his conscience. If she was truly in danger, he needed to know what he was protecting. With careful fingers, he extracted the folded paper from its hiding place. The document was official, heavy paper with federal letterhead. His eyes moved slowly across the formal language, taking in every detail. It was a treaty letter, complete with a carefully drawn map showing water rights granted to the Lakota people. Boone's breath caught when he saw the familiar curve of his spring marked clearly within the tribal boundaries. The letter bore an official signature, but lacked the final stamp that would make it legally binding. A floorboard creaked. Boone looked up to find Wichapi watching him, her face tight with fear. She tried to stand, stumbling on her injured ankle. "Please," she whispered, "I need that paper." Without a word, Boone carefully refolded the document and held it out to her. She took it with trembling fingers, clutching it to her chest. "You're not angry?" she asked, searching his face. "About the spring?" Boone shook his head slowly. "That spring never belonged to me anyway." Relief flooded her features, and she sank back onto her bedroll. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice stronger. "Agent Drummond gave me this letter to translate for my people," she explained. "But when I saw it wasn't stamped, I knew something was wrong. He meant to deny it was ever delivered, to steal the water rights." Her fingers tightened on the paper. "When I wouldn't give it back, the agency building caught fire. His men, I think, but he blamed me." Boone listened without interruption, noting the fear and determination mixed in her voice. When she finished, he simply nodded, accepting her words as truth. "The spring feeds the valley," he said quietly. "Belongs to the land more than any man." Wichapi's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she tucked the document carefully back into her satchel. Most settlers would not see it that way. Most settlers? Boone paused, choosing his words carefully. Haven't spent 20 years listening to the mountain's truth. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the pop of wood in the stove and the whistle of wind outside. Sarah's words from his dream drifted back to him. "Don't let the world make you mean." Perhaps this was what she'd meant, that even in isolation, a man could choose kindness over bitterness, truth over convenience. Boone added another log to the fire, watching as Weechapi carefully restitched the hidden pocket in her satchel. Trust, like the spring water itself, would find its own path forward. 3 days passed like molasses in winter. The blizzard's fury gradually softened to gentle snowfall, then to scattered flurries that danced in the strengthening sunlight. From Boone's cabin porch, the mountain pass slowly emerged from the white haze, a narrow thread between towering peaks. Boone stood at his rough-hewn doorframe, studying the weather signs with eyes trained by decades in the high country. The wind had shifted, carrying warmer air from the south. Good traveling weather if they moved quick enough. Inside, Weechapi sat at his table, wrapping dried meat in squares of worn cotton. Her fingers, though still tender from frostbite, had regained enough strength for simple tasks. The treaty document lay safely in her satchel, never far from reach. Boone cleared his throat, the sound still strange in his own ears after so many silent years. "I can take you halfway," he said, his voice rough as pine bark. "No promises past that." Weechapi looked up, hope and wariness mingling in her dark eyes. "You would do this? Can't let you die in these mountains." He gestured at her swollen ankle. "Won't make it alone?" She nodded, understanding both his offer and its limits. "Thank you." They spent the morning preparing. Boone constructed a simple sled from split cedar planks, padding it with his spare quilt so Weechapi could rest her injured foot. In his tool shed, he found leather straps and brass fixtures that hadn't seen use since Sarah's time. His hands remembered their purpose. His old gelding, Dusty, stood patient in the lean-to shelter, steam rising from his winter-thick coat. Boone brushed him thoroughly, checking his hooves and legs. The horse had been his only company for many years, steady and uncomplaining. Now Boone hitched him to a second sled loaded with supplies: dried elk meat, cornmeal, coffee, extra blankets, and his medical kit. By noon, pale sunlight illuminated their path down toward the timberline. Boone led Dusty carefully, the two sleds creaking behind them through the deep snow. Weechapi sat wrapped in blankets on the first sled, her face turned toward the weak winter sun. The descent was slow, each step measured against the treacherous terrain. As they traveled, Weechapi began to speak, her voice carrying clearly in the crystal mountain air. She told him of her childhood, of learning English from a kind-hearted Presbyterian missionary woman who treated her like a daughter. "Mrs. Bennett taught me to read, to write, to speak in two worlds," she said, her words forming small clouds in the cold. She said knowledge was a bridge between peoples. Boone listened, marking their trail but absorbing every word. When she spoke of losing her only child to pneumonia 2 winters past, his steps faltered briefly. He recognized the hollow note in her voice. It matched the emptiness that had filled him after Sarah's death. "Some say I am too white," she continued, adjusting her position on the sled. "Others say I am too Indian. I am simply myself, trying to do what is right." She paused, watching a pair of ravens circle overhead. "The agent Drummond, he thought he could use me. When I refused to help him steal the water rights, he turned everyone against me." They stopped to rest in a small clearing, the mountain peaks now looming behind them. While Boone checked Dusty's harness and fed him a handful of oats, Weechapi stretched her injured leg carefully. "Your missionary woman," Boone said suddenly, surprising himself. "She teach you about herbs too?" Weechapi shook her head. "No, that knowledge came from my grandmother. She was a medicine woman, keeper of the old ways." A small smile touched her lips. "Mrs. Bennett and my grandmother didn't always agree, but they respected each other. Both wanted to heal people, just in different ways." Boone nodded, understanding. He'd learned long ago that truth could wear many faces. The mountain itself had taught him that. Its moods and seasons, its harshness and beauty, all part of the same whole. They continued downward, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. Dusty's hooves broke trail through the crusted snow, while overhead, the ravens followed their progress, calling to each other in their ancient language. The wind changed without warning. What started as gentle mountain breeze became a howling fury that whipped snow into blinding sheets. Boone recognized the danger immediately. These sudden storms had claimed many lives in the high country. There, he pointed to a dark shape ahead, barely visible through the whiteout. A stone outcropping jutted from the mountainside, offering shelter from the worst of the gale. He guided Dusty carefully toward it, one hand on the lead rope, the other shielding his eyes. Wichapi huddled deeper into her blankets on the sled, her teeth chattering. The day's journey had taxed her strength, and now cold crept into her bones, despite the layers of wool and fur. The outcropping formed a shallow cave, just deep enough to shield them from the wind's bite. Boone worked quickly, years of survival instinct taking over. He secured Dusty in the most protected corner, then gathered pine boughs from nearby trees, weaving them into a crude lean-to against the rock face. "Need to get you warm," he said, noting Wichapi's pallor. Her skin felt hot despite her shivering, fever taking hold. He laid out their bedrolls close together, practical necessity overriding any awkwardness. "Body heat," he explained gruffly. "Only way to survive the night." She nodded, understanding. In the mountains, pride took second place to survival. They huddled under layers of blankets while the wind screamed outside their shelter. Boone melted clean snow in his tin cup, holding it near their small fire. "Here." He pulled a leather pouch from his coat. "Bear root, good for fever." He added dried pieces to the hot water, letting them steep. The sharp, earthy smell filled their shelter. Wichapi's eyes were glassy with fever as she sipped the medicinal tea. "Smells like grandmother's medicine," she murmured. She would approve. Hours passed. The wind showed no sign of weakening. Wichapi drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in Lakota, sometimes in English. Boone kept the fire fed with precious dry wood from his sled supplies, watching her face in the flickering light. Without conscious thought, he began to hum, an old hymn Sarah used to sing while working around their cabin. Amazing grace. The melody felt strange in his throat after so many years of silence, but somehow right for this moment. Wichapi stirred, her fever-bright eyes focusing on him. She listened for a moment, then joined in with a different tune, a gentle Lakota lullaby, her voice weak but clear. The two melodies twined together, a bridge across years of silence and loss. Morning brought pale sunlight and relative calm. Wichapi's fever had broken during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She watched Boone pack up their makeshift camp, his movements efficient and purposeful. "You know," she said, wrapping her blanket tighter, "for such a gruff bear of a man, you have a gentle touch with that tea-making." Boone paused in his work, and something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a small smile, rusty from disuse, but genuine. "Had practice," he said, returning to his tasks. "Sarah, my wife, she taught me about healing herbs, said a man alone in the mountains needed to know such things." They traveled slowly that day, Boone careful not to push too hard after Wichapi's fever. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove of pines. The treaty document, safely stored in Wichapi's satchel, had been on both their minds. Finally, as they sat beside their small fire, Boone voiced the question that had been troubling him. "Why didn't you burn that paper?" Wichapi looked up from her cup of coffee, studying his weathered face in the firelight. "Because truth can't be burned," she said simply. "Only buried." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Boone stared into the flames for a long while, seeing memories in the dancing light. "I buried mine a long time ago," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession felt like pulling a thorn from deep flesh, painful but necessary. Wichapi didn't respond immediately. She understood that some wounds needed silence to heal. They sat together, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky, each holding their own buried truths, but no longer quite so alone with them. The timber chapel emerged from the evening shadows like a painting coming to life. Snow draped its steep roof, and golden lamplight spilled from its windows onto fresh drifts. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, promising warmth within. Boone hesitated at the sight. He hadn't stepped foot in a house of worship since Sarah's funeral. Wichapi noticed his unease. "We need rest," she said softly, "and your horse needs shelter." Before Boone could respond, the chapel door creaked open. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the warm light, an elderly man in a worn black coat, his white hair wild as mountain thistle. He lifted a gnarled hand to shade his clouded eyes. "Who comes calling at sunset?" His voice carried the weight of years, but held kindness in its depths. Boone cleared his throat. "Travelers seeking shelter? Preacher?" The old man's milky eyes widened. That voice? He stepped forward, squinting. "Boone? Boone Dalton? Lord above, is it really you?" "It's me, Elias." Preacher Elias Bramble moved closer, his steps careful on the snowy steps. He reached out, his weathered hands finding Boone's shoulders. "More winters than fingers have passed since I last heard your voice, friend. Welcome home." The preacher turned toward Wichapi, bowing slightly. "And your companion?" "Wichapi," she answered. "Thank you for your kindness, preacher." Come in, come in. The soup's still hot, and these mountains are no place for night wandering." Inside, the chapel smelled of pine smoke and decades of prayer. Simple wooden pews lined the path to a modest altar, and a small harmonium sat in the corner. Elias led them to his quarters behind the sanctuary, where a pot of bean soup simmered on the wood stove. As they ate, Elias spoke of years gone by, his voice gentle with memory. "I remember when you first came to these mountains, Boone. You and Sarah, young and full of dreams." He paused, his clouded eyes distant. "I said the words over her grave, but you were already gone by then, lost to grief." Boone stared into his bowl, the spoon still in his hand. Wichapi watched him carefully, seeing the pain etched deeper than his weathered skin. After the meal, while Elias tended to evening chores, Boone found himself drawn back to the chapel proper. The last light of day filtered through simple glass windows, painting the wooden walls in soft gold. He sat heavily in a pew, feeling the weight of 20 years of silence. Wichapi joined him quietly, leaving space between them. Soon, they heard the creak of the harmonium as Elias settled onto its bench. His fingers, though gnarled with age, found the keys with practiced ease. The first notes of What a Friend We Have in Jesus filled the chapel, slightly out of tune but somehow more beautiful for its imperfection. The familiar hymn reached deep into Boone's heart, stirring memories he'd thought long buried. Sarah's voice singing while she worked, their joined hands during prayer, the simple faith he'd once known. Without conscious thought, his lips began to move. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't asking for safety. Just give me courage. Courage to do what's right." Wichapi heard his whispered prayer. Slowly, carefully, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the pew. The touch was light as a snowflake, but it anchored him to the moment. "The mountain man prays," she said softly, a gentle smile in her voice. "Now I know we'll make it." Boone didn't pull his hand away. Together they sat in the growing darkness while Elias played on, the old harmonium's voice rising and falling like breath. In that moment, something long frozen in Boone's soul began to thaw, like spring coming to the high country after the longest winter. The hymn ended, its final notes fading into the timber beams above. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with possibility, like the pause between heartbeats, between what was and what could be. Dawn painted the chapel windows in pale gold as Preacher Elias helped them load the borrowed mule cart. His weathered hands moved with practiced care, securing bundles of dried meat, flour, and blankets beneath an oiled canvas. "The old girl ain't pretty," Elias said, patting the cart's wooden side, "but she's steady. Mind the left wheel. It favors a wobble on steep ground." He pressed a small Bible into Boone's hands. "For the journey ahead." Boone's fingers traced the worn leather cover. "Much obliged, Elias." The preacher's clouded eyes crinkled with warmth. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, friend. Sometimes he sends us into the wilderness to find our way home." They set out as morning mist still clung to the pines. The cart creaked behind Dusty, who seemed pleased to share his burden with the preacher's mule. Wichapi sat wrapped in blankets among their supplies, her injured ankle still tender. The descent from the chapel brought them into valleys where winter's grip was already loosening. Snow gave way to mud, making the narrow trading path treacherous. Twice they had to stop and dig the wheels free from sticky clay that sucked at them like quicksand. By late afternoon, dark clouds threatened rain. Boone spotted an old line shack tucked against a hillside, its log walls weathered gray as old bone. "We'll stop there," he said, pointing. "Storm's coming." The abandoned shack was simple. One room, a stone fireplace, and a sagging roof that still kept out the worst weather. While Boone gathered firewood and cleared years of debris from the hearth, Wichapi worked at the crude table, mixing flour and water for fry bread. Soon, the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of cooking bread. Fat drops of rain began to drum on the roof as darkness settled outside. They ate by firelight, sharing a comfortable silence that had grown familiar over their days together. After the meal, Wichapi wrapped herself in a blanket and settled closer to the fire. "Tell me," she said softly, "what keeps a man silent for 20 years?" Boone stared into the flames, his hands clasped between his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows in his face. For a long moment, only the rain spoke. "Fear, maybe," he finally said. "Loneliness, for certain. After Sarah... He swallowed hard. "After I lost her, words seemed useless, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands." "Tell me about her," Wichapi urged gently. "What made her laugh?" A ghost of a smile touched Boone's lips. Everything. She found joy in the smallest things. First snow, wild strawberries, the way our old rooster would strut. His voice grew stronger with memory. "She was stubborn as a mule, too. Wouldn't let me win a single argument." "She sounds like a woman who knew her mind." "That she was." The smile faded. "That last morning, I begged her not to make the supply run. Storm was coming in fast, but we needed medicine. She just kissed my cheek and said, 'Since when has winter stopped, Adalton?'" His voice roughened. "Found her 2 days later, frozen under a drift. Hadn't made it halfway to town." Boone's hands trembled slightly. "Buried her on the hill behind our first cabin. Haven't spoken a word since that day. Till you showed up half dead on my doorstep." Wichapi moved closer, her blanket brushing his arm. "Why me?" "Something in your face," he said quietly. "Same determination Sarah had. Couldn't let that light go out." She reached up then, her fingers warm against his weathered cheek. Turning his face toward hers, she pressed a gentle kiss to his other cheek. The touch was soft as a snowflake, but it burned through 20 years of winter. "Your voice never left," she whispered. "It was only waiting for someone to hear it." Boone closed his eyes, feeling tears he thought had frozen forever begin to thaw. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming, but inside the old line shack, spring had finally come to his heart. They sat together by the fire, sharing its warmth, while the night wrapped around them like a prayer. Sometimes healing comes not in grand gestures, but in simple moments, in shared bread, in spoken memories, in the courage to let grief finally find its voice. Morning mist clung to the valleys like a thin blanket, hiding the rider who watched from the rocky bluff above. The scout's horse stood perfectly still, trained not to stamp or snort. Through his brass spyglass, he tracked the slow progress of Boone's cart along the muddy trail below. Agent Drummond would pay well for this information. The day stretched long as Boone and Whichapi pushed deeper into agency territory. The familiar peaks of Boone's mountain retreat disappeared behind them, replaced by rolling hills dotted with scrub pine and early spring grass. The borrowed mule plodded steadily beside Dusty, both animals showing signs of weariness. As evening approached, Boone guided them into a dry creek bed where old cottonwoods offered some shelter. Their gnarled branches cast long shadows in the fading light. The spot wasn't ideal, but options were limited with the mule cart to consider. "We'll rest here," Boone said, helping Whichapi down from the cart. Her ankle had improved, but caution showed in every step. While Boone gathered firewood, Whichapi's eyes kept drifting to the ridge lines above them. Something felt wrong, a tension in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. But she held her tongue, not wanting to worry Boone without proof. Boone noticed it too. As he worked, his keen eyes caught signs that made the hair on his neck rise. Broken twigs that shouldn't be broken. Horse tracks that didn't match their own animal's prints. Disturbed gravel where someone had watched from above. He said nothing, but positioned his rifle within easy reach as they prepared their evening meal. They ate quickly, speaking little. The fire burned low, just enough to ward off the spring night's chill. Both kept their weapons close. Boone's rifle and Whichapi's knife that she'd carried since fleeing the agency. Sleep came in fits and starts. Near midnight, Boone's eyes snapped open. Years of mountain life had taught him to read silence like a book, and something had just turned the page. He lay still, listening. There, the soft click of a horse's hoof on stone. Then, another. Moving with deliberate slowness, Boone gripped his rifle and eased to one knee. In the dying firelight, he made out two shadows circling their camp, keeping to the creek bed's higher banks. Their horses were dark, chosen for night work. The old trapper's rifle came up smooth as silk. The warning shot cracked the night like thunder, echoing off the creek walls. Both riders wheeled their mounts and vanished into the darkness, but their message was clear. They'd found their quarry. Boone and Whichapi stayed alert, backs together, watching the night. Dawn revealed their visitors' parting gift. The borrowed mule lay dead at the edge of camp, its throat cut clean. A warning, as clear as any written threat. Whichapi knelt beside the fallen animal, her hand gentle on its cold flank. "I should have told you sooner," she said, voice tight with guilt. "Drummond's men, they've been tracking me since I fled. I thought we'd lost them in the high country." Boone stood silent for a long moment, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridges. 20 years of solitude had taught him to avoid other people's troubles, but 20 years of solitude had also taught him how hollow safety could be when bought with cowardice. He checked his rifle, then began transferring their most vital supplies to Dusty's saddlebags. His movements were quick and sure, a man who'd made his choice. "Then tomorrow," he said, his gruff voice carrying steel beneath the words, "we ride before dawn." Whichapi watched him work, reading the commitment in every gesture. This man who'd spent 2 decades hiding from the world was now willing to face danger for her cause. The thought warmed her more than any fire could. They buried the mule as best they could with the tools they had, marking its grave with river stones. The cart they pushed into a thicket, covering it with branches. By nightfall, they had reduced their possessions to what 2 riders could carry at speed. That night they took turns watching, though neither slept much. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but they would face it together. The silent mountain man and the Lakota woman, bound by trust, forged in winter's heart. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale gold as Boone and Whichapi pushed their mounts hard through the morning mist. The steady drum of hoofbeats marked their progress toward Pine Ridge Junction, where scattered buildings rose like wooden islands in a sea of spring mud. Smoke from morning fires drifted skyward, carrying the scents of coffee and wood smoke. "There," Wichapi whispered, pointing to a cluster of buildings ahead. "The agency office has a tin roof. The jail's behind it." Boone guided them off the main trail into a dense thicket of young pines. The branches closed around them like a green curtain, hiding their presence from the road. He helped Wichapi down from Dusty, his weathered hands gentle despite their strength. "You remember the plan?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Wichapi nodded, pulling a worn shawl from her saddlebag. The simple garment would help her blend in with the local women who came to trade at the agency store. She tucked the precious treaty letter deep inside her dress, close to her heart. "If I'm not back in 1 hour," she said, adjusting the shawl over her head, "don't do anything foolish." Her attempt at a smile didn't reach her eyes. Boone's only response was a grunt, but his gaze held hers for a long moment. 20 years of silence had taught him that some things didn't need words. Wichapi walked slowly toward town, her limp barely noticeable now. Boone watched until she disappeared around the bend, then settled in to wait, his rifle across his knees. The hour crawled by like molasses in winter. When shouts erupted from the direction of the agency office, Boone's hands tightened on his rifle stock. He forced himself to stay put, counting heartbeats until the full hour passed. Then, he moved. Dusty's hooves splashed through mud puddles as Boone rode into Pine Ridge Junction. He sat straight in the saddle, his old buckskin coat hanging heavy on his shoulders, rifle slung across his back. The few townspeople on the street gave him a wide berth. Something in his face warned them away. The trading post's bell jingled as Boone pushed through the door. Inside, the clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up nervously from his ledger. Boone placed 2 gold coins on the counter. News about the Lakota woman they brought in. The clerk's eyes darted between the coins and Boone's stone-faced expression. "They got her in the agency jail," he said quickly, scooping up the money. "Agent Drummond's pressing charges, arson and theft of government property. Trial's set for Monday morning, but..." He lowered his voice. "Word is they ain't planning to wait that long. Drummond's got papers already drawn up to move her to the territorial prison tonight." Boone nodded once and turned to leave. "Mister," the clerk called after him, "whatever you're thinking of doing, Drummond's got 4 deputies now, mean ones." Without responding, Boone stepped back into the muddy street. His mind was already working through possibilities, none of them good. Then he remembered Sunday was tomorrow, and Preacher Elias had mentioned he'd be holding services in Pine Ridge Junction's chapel. The chapel sat at the edge of town, its whitewashed walls weathered gray by mountain winters. Boone found Elias inside, arranging hymn books in the pews. The old preacher looked up as Boone's shadow darkened the doorway. "I wondered when you'd come," Elias said softly. "I heard about Wichapi's arrest." "Need your help," Boone said, the words coming slow but clear. "Tomorrow, during service." He explained his plan while Elias listened, nodding occasionally. When Boone finished, the preacher was quiet for a long moment, his clouded eyes focused on something distant. "It'll cause quite a stir," he said finally. "The whole town comes to Sunday service, including Agent Drummond and his men." A small smile crossed his weathered face. "Good thing I've always believed the Lord's house is where truth should be spoken loudest." "You'll help then?" "Brother Boone," Elias said, placing a gnarled hand on his arm. "I've been praying 20 years for you to find your voice again. If this is how the good Lord means to answer that prayer, who am I to argue?" They spent the next hour working out details. When Boone finally left the chapel, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. He rode Dusty slowly past the agency jail, marking its layout, counting guards. Through a barred window, he caught a glimpse of a familiar shawl. His jaw tightened. Tomorrow would change everything. For all of them. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp over Pine Ridge Junction. Inside his rented room at the boarding house, Boone stood before a clouded mirror, dragging a freshly sharpened razor across his weathered cheeks. Each careful stroke revealed skin that hadn't seen daylight in years. Water dripped from his chin into a chipped basin below. He'd forgotten how long this simple ritual took. 20 years of mountain living had left him more familiar with tangles of gray beard than with the stranger's face emerging in the mirror. His hands remembered, though, steady and sure despite the years. The clean shirt lay waiting on his narrow bed. Borrowed from Preacher Elias, stark white against the rough wool blanket. Boone's fingers fumbled with the small buttons, unused to such delicate work. The collar felt like a noose around his neck, but he left it buttoned tight. Today wasn't about comfort. The treaty letter sat folded in his breast pocket, its presence heavy against his heart. He'd memorized every word the night before, though reading it aloud would be another matter entirely. His voice, unused to sustained speech, might fail him, but that fear seemed distant now, replaced by a stronger purpose. Pine Ridge Junction's chapel bell rang 8 times as townspeople began filing in for Sunday service. Women in their best calico dresses herded children up the wooden steps. Men in polished boots and string ties nodded to each other, discussing cattle prices and spring planting. None paid much attention to the tall, clean-shaven stranger who slipped in among them. Boone took a seat halfway back, his eyes fixed on the rough-hewn cross hanging behind the pulpit. The pews filled quickly around him. He noticed Agent Drummond's men stationed near the doors, and Wichapi herself in the last row, flanked by guards. Her hands were bound, but her head was held high. Preacher Elias began the service with a familiar hymn. Boone's throat tightened at the sound of so many voices raised together, a thing he'd forgotten he missed. The sermon that followed spoke of truth and justice, of light shining in dark places. Elias's clouded eyes seemed to find Boone in the crowd as he preached. When the sermon reached its midpoint, Boone's legs moved of their own accord. He stood, his height drawing all eyes. The borrowed shirt crackled as he withdrew the letter from his pocket. "Begging your pardon, preacher," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong through the sudden silence. "But there's truth that needs speaking here today." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Agent Drummond's men shifted, hands moving toward weapons, but in the sacred space of the chapel, they held back. Boone unfolded the letter with careful movements. "This here's a treaty grant," he continued, "signed by federal authorities 6 months ago. It guarantees water rights to the Lakota people, rights that some men aim to steal by burning papers and blaming innocents." His eyes found Agent Drummond in the crowd as he read the document aloud, each word deliberate and damning. The agent's face grew darker with each paragraph. When Boone finished, he pointed to Wichapi. That woman there carried this truth at the risk of her life, while others tried to bury it with fire and false charges. Preacher Elias stepped down from his pulpit, moving to stand beside Boone. "I will witness," the old man declared, his voice ringing with authority, "that this paper was sealed and seen. I served as scrivener in the territorial court. I know a legitimate document when I see one." The chapel erupted in whispered conversations. Agent Drummond stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Without a word, he strode toward the door, shouldering past his own confused deputies. Someone shouted for the telegraph office to be opened. Sunday or not, this news couldn't wait. Others crowded around Boone and Elias, examining the treaty letter with their own eyes. The guards by Wichapi looked uncertainly at each other, then stepped away from her. By noon, the telegraph operator's keys were clicking steadily, sending messages to the territorial marshal about Agent Drummond's crimes. But the agent himself was nowhere to be found. His office stood empty, desk drawers hanging open, his private ledger missing. The truth, once spoken, had done its work. Just as Wichapi had said that night in the mountains, it couldn't be burned, only buried. And now, like a spring seed breaking through winter soil, It had finally reached the light. The morning's revelation at the chapel sparked fierce debate throughout Pine Ridge Junction. By early afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the whitewashed building, their voices rising with the heat of the day, dust kicked up from stamping boots as settlers and townsfolk argued about water rights and old claims. Amos Haggerty, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, pushed through the crowd. His weathered face was red with indignation as he jabbed a finger toward the treaty letter being passed around. "Now wait just 1 minute," he called out, his voice cutting through the din. "My cattle have watered at that spring for 15 years. You can't tell me I got no rights to it." Several other ranchers nodded in agreement, their faces grim beneath their hat brims. Wichapi stood quietly on the chapel steps, her newly freed hands folded before her. The morning's events had left her tired but resolute. She watched the crowd's anger build, remembering similar scenes that had ended in violence. But this time was different. She had truth on her side and unexpected allies. "My people," she began, her clear voice drawing all eyes, "and my neighbors." She emphasized the word, including everyone in her gaze. "The water flows for all who thirst. Why should we fight over what the Creator freely gives?" The crowd grew still, listening. Even Haggerty lowered his finger, though his jaw remained set. "I propose this," Wichapi continued, descending one step. "Let us share the spring's blessing. We can form a council, equal numbers from the tribe and the town, to oversee fair access for all. No one turned away, no one taking more than their share." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others shook their heads. Haggerty opened his mouth to object, but before he could speak, Boone's tall figure appeared beside Wichapi on the steps. "That spring fed me for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I owe it more than I can say, and it never once ran dry, even sharing with elk and deer." He looked directly at Haggerty. "Reckon it can handle a few more folks drinking from it." Preacher Elias emerged from the chapel door, his blind eyes somehow finding the heart of the crowd. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we'll hold a proper meeting. 10 o'clock sharp. Let's put this agreement in writing, witnessed by God and neighbor alike." The crowd began to disperse, talking in smaller groups now. Even Haggerty's expression had softened somewhat, though he still grumbled as he walked away. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. As the town settled into evening quiet, Boone and Wichapi walked together toward the spring that had started it all. Their boots crunched on the rocky path, the only sound besides distant coyote calls and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The spring burbled up from between moss-covered rocks, clear as crystal in the fading light. They stood at its edge, watching the water catch the last rays of sun. 20 years of solitude had flowed from this place, Boone thought. 20 years of silence broken by a knock at his door. "I thought love was buried with my wife," he said quietly, his voice barely louder than the spring's gentle song. "But I was wrong." Wichapi turned to look at him, her dark eyes soft with understanding. The wind lifted strands of her black hair, carrying the scent of sage and wild roses. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The truth between them was as clear as the water flowing at their feet. They stood together as darkness crept up from the valley, two people who had lost everything once, now finding something unexpected in each other. The spring continued its eternal song, promising life and renewal to all who would share its gifts. The next morning dawned cold and clear over Pine Ridge Junction. By 9:30, townsfolk and tribal members filed into the chapel, their breath visible in the crisp air. Preacher Elias had arranged the pews in a circle, breaking down the usual barriers between pulpit and congregation. The morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. At 10 o'clock sharp, Elias stood at a small table covered with papers and inkwells. His weathered hands traced the edge of the document he'd spent half the night drafting. Though his eyes couldn't see the words, his fingers knew every line. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice warm in the hushed chapel. "We gather today to make something new, a covenant between all who share this land." Wichapi sat near the front, her dark shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. Boone stood at the back, leaning against a wall, but his eyes never left her. Amos Haggerty and other ranchers filled one side, while tribal elders occupied the other. The tension from yesterday had mellowed into something more thoughtful. Elias read the covenant aloud, his voice steady and clear. The agreement was simple, but fair: shared access to the spring, scheduled times for livestock watering, protection of the water's purity, and a council of 6 members, equally chosen from town and tribe, to oversee it all. "Who will sign first?" Elias asked, holding out the quill. Haggerty surprised everyone by standing. "Reckon I will," he said, taking off his hat. "My daddy always said a man's word is his bond." He scratched his name onto the paper, then nodded at the tribal elders. One by one, representatives from both communities added their marks. As the signing continued, something shifted in the room. People who had stood apart began to talk, sharing stories of dry years and wet seasons. A woman from town mentioned she had extra quilts at home. Another offered preserved fruit from her cellar. By noon, wagons were already rolling toward the Lakota encampment, loaded with food, blankets, and winter supplies. Outside the chapel, the town council approached Boone. "We need a sheriff's aide," the mayor said, "someone who knows both sides of the fence." Boone shook his head before they finished asking. "Much obliged," he said quietly, "but I've had my fill of fences." He found Wichapi later, helping sort the donations at the tribal camp. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the wind. Boone waited until she finished directing a wagon where to unload. "I'm heading back to the cabin tomorrow," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Been thinking maybe it's too big for just one person." He paused, searching for words that had rusted from disuse. "There's room enough for 2 if you've a mind to come." Wichapi continued folding a blanket, her hands steady though her heart quickened. She didn't answer, but the slight smile at the corner of her mouth told Boone she'd heard. That evening, sleet began falling across Pine Ridge Junction, coating the windows of the chapel in a silvery sheen. Boone and Wichapi sat before the hearth in the back room, where Elias had offered them shelter for the night. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Their hands rested on the bench between them, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's skin. The sleet tapped against the windows like tiny fingers, a rhythmic counterpoint to the popping logs in the fireplace. Wichapi watched the flames, remembering other fires, in her childhood lodge, in her own home before her husband died, in Boone's cabin during that first desperate night. So many changes, so many paths leading to this moment. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Boone's hand moved slightly, his pinky finger brushing against hers. The touch was light as a feather, but carried the weight of 20 years of solitude, of grief finally thawing like spring ice. "We let spring come," he replied, his words mixing with the sound of sleet and flame. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Neither moved to pull their hands away. Outside, the weather continued its winter song, but in the warmth of the chapel, something new was taking root, as sure and steady as water rising from deep springs. A week after the meeting in Pine Ridge Junction, Boone guided his horse up the familiar mountain trail toward home. Spring thaw had turned the path muddy, forcing careful navigation around deep ruts and slick patches. The gelding's hooves made wet-sucking sounds with each step, but Boone knew this route like he knew his own heartbeat. The late afternoon sun filtered through bare branches, casting long shadows across melting snow. Here and there, tiny green shoots pushed through the dampness, the first whispers of spring reaching toward warmth. Boone noticed them all: wintergreen leaves unfurling, early wildflowers dotting sunny patches, deer tracks fresh in soft earth. His cabin appeared through the trees exactly as he'd left it, though somehow different now. The silence that had once felt like a comfort now seemed empty, waiting to be filled. Boone led his horse to the lean-to stable, removed the saddle, and rubbed him down with dry grass. The familiar routine settled his thoughts. Inside the cabin, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight. Boone built up the fire, its warmth chasing away the winter chill that had crept in during his absence. Then he began to work, moving with quiet purpose. He cleared space in the storage chest, arranged his few dishes more neatly on the shelf, swept the wooden floor until it gleamed. The next morning, he walked into the forest and chose a sturdy pine log, dragging it back to his work area behind the cabin. All day, he shaped and smoothed the wood, crafting a second chair for the porch. His hands remembered the work from 20 years ago, when he'd made the first one. The rhythmic scrape of tools against wood filled the clearing with peaceful sound. By sunset, the new chair stood finished beside its older companion. Boone ran his hand over the smooth armrest, testing for splinters. The two chairs looked right together, like they'd always been meant to be a pair. Each morning after that, Boone rose early and walked to the spring. He gathered fresh pine needles and steeped them with the last of his tea leaves, leaving a steaming cup on the windowsill. Beside it, he placed whatever flowers he could find. Tiny white stars of early bloodroot, delicate purple violets, bright yellow coltsfoot blooming in sunny spots. 6 days passed this way. The tea grew cold and was poured out each evening. The flowers wilted and were replaced. Boone worked steadily, speaking little but praying much. Short, simple prayers of gratitude and hope. On the 7th morning, the sun rose clear and bright. Boone had just set out fresh tea and a perfect pine flower when hoofbeats echoed through the trees. His heart quickened at the sound, but he didn't move from the porch. He waited, watching the trail. Wichapi appeared through the morning mist, like a dream taking solid form. She rode easily despite the muddy path, her dark hair catching glints of sunlight. A basket was tied securely behind her saddle, and a rolled wool blanket rested across her lap. She dismounted gracefully near the cabin, leading her horse to water. Every movement was unhurried, deliberate. Boone remained on the porch, his hands resting quietly on his knees. No words passed between them yet. None were needed. After tending to her horse, Wichapi untied her basket. The scent of dried berries drifted on the breeze as she lifted the lid. Inside lay carefully wrapped packets of seeds, herbs for medicine, flowers for beauty, vegetables for sustenance. The wool blanket in her arms was dyed in rich earth tones, woven with patterns that told stories of rivers and mountains. She carried these things to the cabin's door, setting them down with gentle care. Then she turned and walked to the porch, her steps sure and steady. The new chair waited beside Boone's, its pine surface glowing golden in the morning light. Wichapi sat down, adjusting her shawl. The chair fit her perfectly, as if it had been shaped for her form alone. She reached for the tea on the windowsill, still warm, and breathed in its fragrant steam. The pine flower she tucked into her hair, where it caught the light like a star. They sat together in the growing warmth of the day, watching spring slowly paint the valley in shades of green and gold. No desperate storm had driven her here this time, no pursuit or fear or need for shelter. She had come freely, carrying seeds of new life and choosing hope over solitude. The mountain air filled with birdsong and the soft whisper of melting snow. In time, they would speak of plans and plantings, of joining their separate lives into something shared. But for now, they simply sat side by side in their matching chairs, while morning light blessed the path that had led them both home. Evening settled softly over the mountain cabin as lengthening shadows crept across weathered floorboards. Boone moved with practiced ease in the familiar space, though everything felt different now. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. Instead, it hummed with quiet life and gentle purpose. He stirred the elk stew simmering in his old iron pot, adding pinches of dried herbs that Wichapi had brought. The rich aroma filled the cabin, mixing with wood smoke and fresh pine. His movements were steady, deliberate, as he tended the cooking meat and vegetables. The brass lantern needed cleaning before lighting. Boone wiped the glass carefully with a soft cloth, making sure each panel sparkled. When he finally lit it, the warm glow cast dancing shadows on the log walls. The flame inside burned steady and bright, like a tiny star brought down to earth. From her place near the hearth, Wichapi worked on the evening bread. Her fingers moved skillfully as she folded dried berries into the warm dough. The berries were ones she'd gathered herself, preserved through the winter months. They dotted the bread like small jewels, promising bursts of sweetness. As she worked, she began to sing softly. The melody was gentle, rising and falling like water over stones. Though Boone didn't understand the Lakota words, the song's meaning reached him anyway. It spoke of home, of comfort, of peace found after long searching. They shared the meal in comfortable quiet, savoring each bite. The stew was rich and warming, the berry bread sweet and fresh. Lamplight gleamed on tin cups and well-worn spoons. Outside, a late winter wind whispered through pine boughs, but inside all was still and warm. After they finished eating, they sat together near the dying fire. Red embers pulsed like beating hearts beneath gray ash. The cabin creaked and settled around them, familiar sounds that had once marked Boone's solitude but now spoke of shared shelter. Boone watched the firelight play across Wichapi's face, catching in her dark eyes. 20 years of silence had built walls around his heart, but she had walked through them as easily as morning mist parts around pine trees. The words he needed to say had been waiting all that time, growing stronger in their stillness. He stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he turned and knelt beside her chair. His knees pressed against the rough wooden floor, but he barely noticed. All his attention was focused on her face, on finding the courage to speak what his heart had finally learned. "I haven't spoken to a woman in 20 years, he said, his voice rough but clear. "I think I'd like to spend the rest of my life making up for that." Wichapi's eyes softened as she looked at him. She reached out and cupped his weathered cheek in her palm. Her touch was warm and gentle, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Then begin now," she replied simply. Boone leaned forward, drawn by a force as natural as gravity. He kissed her with all the tenderness his heart had stored away during those silent years. It was a kiss full of reverence, of gratitude, of wonder at finding love again when he'd thought that door forever closed. Beyond the cabin walls, spring was working its ancient magic. The last grip of winter weakened with each passing hour. Tiny streams of melting snow trickled down the mountainside. New buds swelled on bare branches, ready to burst into leaf. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the season to turn. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Boone and Wichapi remained close. His silence had been a shelter once, a way to survive grief too deep for words. But now that same silence had led him here, to this moment, this woman, this new beginning. He had found his voice again, not in spite of those quiet years, but because of them. They had taught him to listen, to wait, to recognize love when it finally came walking through his door. The lantern flame burned steady, casting their shadows on the wall. Two shapes merged into one. Outside, the wind gentled, and the first stars began to shine through breaking clouds. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.